Muy buenos días a todos. Muchísimas gracias por estar aquí en el espacio Pettelsmann. Agradecemos a nuestros anfitriones que nos hayan acogido una vez más y a todos ustedes por estar aquí, por supuesto, a todos nuestros panelistas. Para el Real Instituto Elcano, los temas de defensa y seguridad son un eje central de nuestra estrategia y de nuestra agenda de investigación. De hecho, constituyen uno de nuestros pilares. En los últimos años hemos conseguido que una serie de patronos relacionados con el mundo de la defensa estén apoyando la labor del Instituto y, por supuesto, contamos con el Ministerio de Asuntos Exteriores y contamos con el Ministerio de Defensa que nos apoyan y nos guían en el desarrollo de esta agenda analítica. El tema OTAN es clave. Gracias a nuestros patronos públicos conseguimos estar en aquella reunión, la Asamblea de Madrid de OTAN, designados como uno de los think tanks que manejaron la agenda civil de pensamiento. Hemos vuelto a estar en las siguientes asambleas de OTAN y, sin duda alguna, el tema de OTAN, la defensa, la seguridad, la capacidad de disuasión y de garantizar la seguridad de los miembros de la Alianza y de los miembros europeos es uno de los temas centrales. Así que para nosotros es un inmenso placer dar hoy la bienvenida a este grupo de panelistas que van a intentar desgranar las preguntas que supongo todos ustedes tienen en la cabeza y que han ocupado los medios de comunicación y el debate político en los últimos meses. Quiero especialmente agradecer al secretario de Estado del Ministerio de Asuntos Exteriores, de la Unión Europea y Cooperación, por estar hoy aquí. Y para no robarle más tiempo, le doy la bienvenida a este podio para que el secretario de Estado nos dirija y abra este acto tan importante para el Real Instituto Elcano. Secretario de Estado.
Pues muchas gracias, José Juan, por tu discurso introductorio, and welcome everybody to this public conference hosted by the Real Instituto Elcano. I would like to start by expressing our appreciation for the work of NATO's Public Diplomacy Division, whose role has been capital to build this session on the strengthening of NATO. So today's discussion, as we can see, is preventing war, defending more, the strengthening of NATO. There are few topics I think are more timely at a time when the international situation is more unpredictable than ever, and when alliances are therefore more important than ever. I would say that the distinctive trait of recent years is the increase in the number and intensity of conflicts around the world, and these conflicts range from the all-out Russian aggression against Ukraine, also non-state actors, but non-state actors that are achieving near-state capabilities, oftentimes thanks to external support, and also our old enemy terrorism. And I want to stress that the epicenter of world terrorism is now a short flight from Madrid in the Sahel region, where 50% of victims of terrorism occur in 2024. So in order to respond to this instability, I mean, there are many aspects. We need, and this is a priority of Spanish foreign policy, we need support for multilateral institutions and international law, which with all its limitations, is the only tool to peacefully manage interstate relations. We also need to address internally new threats that undermine our societal cohesion. And of course, and that's the topic today, we need to maintain and strengthen our deterrence. NATO is the foremost deterrence organization in the world, based on its commitment to mutual defense and a strong transatlantic link. We were proud to host the summit in Madrid in 2022, during which we welcomed 2 new allies, Finland and Sweden, and we adopted a new strategic concept adapted to the new situation created by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Deterrence is first, and I would say almost foremost, a factor of capabilities. And NATO allies are significantly stepping up their capabilities. In the case of Spain, we will meet the 2% spending pledge this year, which means a 46% increase on defense spending over 2024. And we will meet our capability commitments as we agree with NATO. But I want to underline the distance we have traveled since 2018, when the current government took office. Spanish defense spending at the time was below 0.9% of GDP. This means that spending has doubled, more than doubled, in fact, in terms of GDP, and almost tripled in absolute terms, given the high economic growth Spain has been experiencing. Of course, spending more is crucial, but increased spending must go hand in hand with better spending, which also entails spending together through joint projects, shared procurement, and cooperative industrial programs, both at NATO and European levels. And strengthening NATO deterrence in current times also means deepening the strategic relationship with the EU. First, the EU needs to reinforce its capabilities here in our continent, including our defense industry, and this will make us better and more valuable allies to our friends across the Atlantic. We need also to work on NATO-EU interoperability through shared standards and reinforce regular NATO-EU dialogues, including between the North Atlantic Council and the EU Political and Security Committee. Concerning specifically Spain, the government will continue to support the national and European defense industry in order to increase its competitiveness, overcome its fragmentation, and will continue to provide support to our companies in order to increase their participation in European projects and on international tenders. But military capabilities are only a part of deterrence, which is the best way of preventing war, and resolve is essential. And Spain understands this and is showing it daily through its commitment to the security of its allies, by having the largest deployment ever on NATO's eastern flank, where NATO faces its most important threat. We are contributing with troops, warships, warplanes, and raiders in Lithuania, Latvia, Slovakia, and Romania as framework nation, more than 2,000 troops. We responded immediately to the call for Eastern Sentry, and 10 Spanish fighters are already on patrol on the eastern flank. And we are also increasing our presence in the north through exercises and the first ever warplane deployment in Iceland over the summer. Now, it's also my conviction that the best investment in European deterrence, but also the best signal of our collective resolve, is continued support for Ukraine against Russian aggression. Spain has been steadfast in its support from day one. We have provided billions of euros in military, financial, and humanitarian support for Ukraine, and will continue to do so. As you may know, the President of Ukraine is in Spain today, and a substantial aid package will be announced. We are also contributing for the last 3.5 years to more than 10% of the European Union military and financial aid through the EU budget. And we favor all, and I underline all, efforts to step up support at the European level. I want to say that there should be no mistake about the fact that whether we like it or not, the war against Ukraine will be seen as a test for our resolve in the coming years. Thirdly, an important aspect of any alliance is cohesion alliance, and cohesion requires strategic convergence among the allies. What this means in practical terms, and we included this in our external action strategy, which we adopted before the summer, is increasing the perception of threats to allies as threats to ourselves. And it is with this spirit that we have deployed along the eastern flank, while we insist on keeping a focus on the southern flank. The 2022 Madrid concept identifies a second threat: terrorism, instability in regions of interest such as the Sahel, West Africa, and the Middle East. And our approach to the southern flank relies on fully developing the agenda for the South within the framework of NATO's action plan for the southern neighborhood, a pragmatic agenda based on dialogue with partners. And I must stress that NATO has made significant progress on this count, thanks to the strategic concept, thanks to efforts by many of the allies, and also thanks to the work of our Special Representative, Javier Colomina. The expanded network of partners in the Global South and Indo-Pacific is an important element for our alliance. We support strengthening cooperation with NATO's key Indo-Pacific partners, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and New Zealand, as shown by the fact that their first presence at the NATO summit took place here in Madrid. And this year, Spanish forces took part in Operation High Mast and Pacific Skies in Asia. And there's also a broader strategic level that we need to think. We have immediate threats, and we have also threats that are materializing before our eyes. We need prevention and anticipation of those threats. Many of those are non-military in nature, but undermine our public debate and democratic institutions. First, and this is already a clear and present threat, foreign interference on our political process. This is a consistent and organized effort, well-funded effort as well, which constitutes a dire threat and that we need to counter through practical, effective, and significant measures that are equal to the nature of the challenge they pose. And FIMI, as it's commonly known, takes advantage of existing divisions within our societies, which we need to mitigate through policies that promote our own social cohesion as well. And now, on a more medium to long-term perspective, NATO also needs to address the impact of emerging and disruptive technologies on deterrence and defense, including, this is more immediate, drones, of course, and the field where our Ukrainian friends are far ahead of us. We have much to learn from them. But on the medium term, also new technologies like robotics or quantum. This is not the distant future. We're talking about a few years, probably. And there are also potentially disruptive technologies which are already being applied, such as artificial intelligence, and Spain supports a concerted action on the use of responsible artificial intelligence in the military domain, engaging with military industries and stakeholders. In face of these hybrid threats, NATO certainly needs to defend more, but surely with better coordination among allies and within our own countries. This means a whole-of-government approach that integrates military, intelligence, cybersecurity, diplomacy, and law enforcement. More and better training, for instance, the European Centers of Excellence, which are useful tools. Strategic communication, operations, and counter-propaganda, and cyber defense and the build-up of offensive capabilities. So this is a tall order, and I don't think we will solve all problems here on the debate today, but I'm sure this debate will contribute to advancing the debate. And to sum up, as we continue to advance from a rules-based world to one dominated by power dynamics, NATO's role remains crucial to guarantee allied security. In the coming years, Spain will remain a committed NATO ally and European partner. We will continue contributing to the security of our allies and promoting international stability through dialogue, multilateralism, and cooperation. So I wish you all a fruitful exchange of views on the strengthening of NATO and a productive time in Madrid. Thank you very much.
Bueno, empezamos. Muchísimas gracias al secretario de Estado por un magnífico discurso, por enmarcarnos en el contexto adecuado. Buenas tardes a todos. Soy Luis Simón, director de la oficina de Bruselas e investigador principal en el Real Instituto Elcano, y tengo el placer de moderar esta mesa redonda. Como decía, en primer lugar, muchas gracias al secretario de Estado y a nuestro presidente por lanzar el debate. Voy a pasar al inglés por deferencia a nuestros panelistas, aunque tenemos un panelista que va a intervenir en español y a él le interpelaré en español, claramente. So, good afternoon, Ana, Robert, Daniel, Carlos. So we're here to take stock of NATO's ongoing transformation process. And we had, I would say, a rather successful, relatively successful summit in The Hague. We were there back in June. As you know, following President Trump's arrival in power earlier this year, there was a lot of speculation about America's commitment, or rather lack thereof, not only to Ukraine, but also to NATO and European security more broadly. And I would personally say that the summit in The Hague confirmed that America's commitment to NATO remains strong, but it is not unconditional. It is not a free pass. It remains conditional on the European allies stepping up, both in terms of defense spending, but also in terms of assuming primary responsibility for Europe's conventional defense, to use the words of War Secretary Pete Hegseth, or Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth. And of course, the Defense Investment Pledge adopted in The Hague, which, as you know, entailed two pillars, 3.5% for traditional defense spending and 1.5% for indirect spending, supporting security and defense, of course gathered much public attention, not least of all here in Spain, as you may recall. And of course, there are a lot of important questions going forward. Of course, the evolution of the war in Ukraine will have profound implications for all of this. And a critical question also relates to whether the European allies are ready to take primary responsibility for their own conventional defense, militarily, industrially, technologically, and politically. And another important question relates to the future U.S. military role in Europe. And we are all awaiting the publication of the U.S. National Defense Strategy that will hopefully shed some light on some of these questions. And of course, another very important question relates to whether Russia actually believes the U.S. commitment to NATO and European security is indeed ironclad, as the Americans keep repeating. Because many analysts have seen Russia's recent violations of European airspace as a test of both European resolve and transatlantic cohesion. Now, to help us navigate all these questions and other questions, we've got a terrific lineup of speakers here today. Let me just introduce them briefly. Right in the middle, we have Anna Wieslander, who is the director for Northern Europe at the Atlantic Council and head of the Council's office in Stockholm. She's, of course, a very well-known expert in transatlantic relations and European security, and has had a very distinguished, very impressive career spanning the think tank world, the private sector, as well as government. Anna, welcome to Madrid. Great to have you here. To my immediate left, we have Robert, who's a senior fellow with the Center for Eastern Studies in Warsaw. And he's also had a very distinguished career, both at the Polish government and NATO. And he actually headed for 5 years NATO's information office in Moscow. one of the toughest jobs in Europe, as they say. Daniel, right next to Anna, Daniel Fiot, he's a non-resident fellow at Elcano. He's also head of defense and statecraft with CSDS in Brussels. And prior to that, he served as defense editor with the EU Institute for Security Studies. And he is one of the, if not the, leading experts on European defense, particularly the industrial and technological aspects of defense. And then last, but most certainly not least, to my far left, I don't know if that's where he belongs, but to my far left, we have our dear friend Carlos Carnero, who's a member of Elcano's Advisory Council, university professor, and senior advisor at Vinces. He has served recently in the NATO Secretary General's reflection group on the Southern Neighborhood. And before that, he's had, of course, a long and distinguished career in government, both in Madrid and in Brussels, having served for 15 years as member of the European Parliament. So I've asked the speakers to try to kick us off with some introductory remarks of no more than 7 minutes, and hopefully we'll stick to that time. And then, if there's time, I may follow up with a question or two, and after that, I'll open the floor for questions from the audience. And there's, of course, a translation available. Starting with Anna. Anna, it'd be great if you could give us a general assessment of where NATO stands a few months after The Hague, and especially in light of current debates on burden sharing and ongoing questions about America's engagement in Europe. So what's your assessment of the transatlantic relationship today and of the new spending pledges in light of the evolving security situation in Europe? Welcome to Madrid.
Thank you so much, Luis and Elcano. It's great to be here. Well, I would like to, you mentioned a few things in your introduction here, and I thought I'll start by taking us back to February when the Trump administration just had kicked off, and Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, they came to Europe and they had four quite brutal messages, or at least they were presented in brutal ways, but I still think those key messages are important for us to take in. So the first one was on Europe. And basically they said, you know, Europe, you're prosperous, you should be able to take care of your own security. It will not be a priority for the Trump administration. Secondly, on Russia, their assessment is that Russia is not a prime threat to the US. China is, and our own borders. That's where we will have our main focus, not on Russia. Thirdly, on Ukraine, Ukraine is not either primarily a US problem. It's something for Europe to take the long-term responsibility for. And fourth, NATO. So NATO, yes, US will keep its engagement for NATO. We are not leaving NATO. On the contrary, we want a more lethal NATO. That's a very important message because we remember the first Trump administration, there were threats that the US would leave NATO. But no, the US is in NATO, but the aim for NATO, for the US, is to basically provide what we call the nuclear umbrella, the nuclear deterrent, while Europe really should step up and take most of the conventional forces. And that's, of course, a huge challenge. But that is the direction from the US. Now, this was really a slap in the face, a shock to the Europeans. And you remember we had the EU Big Bang coming out in March as basically a reaction against the US, not against Russia, but against the US. But when it comes to NATO, I think it's important to see that now, after The Hague, as you said, The Hague was a successful summit. President Trump was happy and gave credit to European allies. Now we have a better tone among allies in NATO, but those four key messages on Europe, on Russia, on Ukraine, on NATO, they remain from the US side. Nothing has changed there. Those assessments are still there. So that's where we are now, half a year later. Now, we are waiting for more of a practical implementation from the US side. What does this mean for NATO? We haven't seen much. There were some troop reductions in Romania. On the rotational side, there is more to come. We have heard, I think, in the spring, if you talk to NATO officials, they were worried that the US will pull the rug. This will be another shock, you know. They will withdraw huge amounts of troops, and kind of the only way to get Europe to react is to pull the rug and leave us like this. And now the sense is that perhaps it will not be that chaotic. There are hopes that this will be an orderly process. What the Americans, the Trump administration representatives have said repeatedly is that there will be consultations. We will try to make this a process where we do not have major security gaps, because that could invite Russia to take an opportunity on Europe. And they recognize that. However, they say, we will talk to you, but maybe you will not like what you hear. So we should be prepared, I believe, for more blunt discussions with the Americans. Now, my last point is that I think it's interesting to watch NATO. I go there frequently to NATO headquarters and have conversations, and you can see that NATO is already changing. I would argue NATO is already becoming more European. Two examples that are at least related to NATO is that now the UK and France are leading on preparing a coalition of the willing security guarantees for Ukraine. That's not an American-led process, which I think, you know, 1 or 2 years ago, that would definitely have been the Americans leading such an effort. Secondly, on the Ramstein format for military support to Ukraine, that was an American initiative led by the US until this spring when the UK and Germany took on responsibility for that process. So you already have two processes where the Europeans are assuming more responsibility. And I believe as we are developing, pouring more money into defense, developing capabilities, taking on more responsibility, the military capability will also spur a process where we have more political responsibility within NATO. So this is a process that has started. So I will just wrap up by saying I think this process has started. We will not see a coming back to where we were. We are moving into something new within NATO. And I think the Europeans are starting to recognize this in a bit more less of a shocked way, more of a rational way. But I still think we need to be more forward-leaning in what kind of vision of European responsibility do European allies foresee that we take. Can we present something? Can we be more forward-leaning towards the Americans? Present more of initiatives on the table that they can react to? Or are we still, which I think we are in a bit, waiting for the Americans to lead in a more traditional way, which they probably will not? So I think that's one of the challenges that we are facing right now. And I'll stop there. Look forward to the conversation.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Anna, for such an excellent introduction and for explaining the US's position on Europe in such a sober and succinct way, and also for raising, I believe, the right questions and prompts on burden sharing. Let's now maybe turn over to Robert for maybe a general assessment of what is one of the key, if not the key challenge for NATO, which is the Russian threat in the eastern flank and the NATO-Russia relationship more broadly. As I said, Robert was in charge of the NATO Public Information Office in Moscow for 5 years, right before and during the annexation of Crimea. So he's got a unique perspective on the NATO-Russia relationship. And perhaps also, if you can, touch on the situation in Ukraine as you see it, and if there's time, maybe a little bit, given your Polish background, on the drone incursions as well. Over to you, Robert, and great to have you here.
Thank you, Luis, and thank you for the invitation to Elcano and to you, and really needs to be advertised what a great flag bearer Luis is for Elcano in Brussels. It's great to be in Madrid. For me, Madrid has a particular important spot because, you know, I was a Polish diplomat when we were lobbying to get into NATO, as to put it simply, and the invitation came, of course, in this city in 1997. So summit 2022 is important, but for me, this was really the moment. And then I joined NATO myself. So, trying to do my job as asked by Luis. So, I guess one of the most existential questions which could be or is being posed in Europe these days is should we seriously contemplate the outbreak of an open military conflict between NATO and Russia? Some years ago, including at the time, and indeed I was in Moscow, and you know the Russian kind of Anschluss of Crimea, the most people's answer was not really. I mean, you know, no country, apart from Al Qaeda, but that organization has ever thrown the gauntlet, has openly attacked NATO. It's a fact, and there are good reasons for it because it knows, and that includes Russia, that it would not stand much chance of winning this. But of course, the odds started changing because of the policy of Russia, and I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about that. After all, since 2013, you know, Russia has conducted a military invasion in Syria. It's, you know, multiplied provocations involving military nature and continued militarization of its own society, you know. And this is really important because we cannot look at the sort of Russia's intentions. We are looking at the intentions of the regime, which should not be equated with the interest of Russia as such. It's a captured state, if you like. And, you know, Putin is not a suicide man. He's, you know, if one watched his behavior during COVID, this is a man who deeply cares about his health, safety, and longevity. But he has developed what one might call a brinkmanship trait. As the unsuccessful invasion, full scale, of Ukraine in 2022 showed, his disassociation from reality means that his reading, his risk assessment is at fault. You know, he was badly advised by his trusted intelligence and security services, but this is actually a worrying sign because even if he does not want to take undue risks, his assessment of those risks is wrong. And you know, he has essentially shown that he believes that, you know, the war at all costs that Russia is conducting is still strong because he has formatted the whole state apparatus, the economy, and to a large extent the Russian society for that war. And although I would argue he's not a great historian, but he understands enough from Russian history, Russian Soviet history, that each time Russia lost the war, it had very significant bad consequences for the regime. I mean, that was the situation after, you know, the war against Japan, beginning of 20th century, you know, First World War, and of course even the Afghanistan intervention. So he's afraid that, you know, if you have hundreds of thousands of probably armed Russian military or whatever, volunteers, call them what you like, combatants coming back when the war is not won, that will be a mortal danger for the regime. He's also aware of the fact that he's not confident right now in starting a winter war in European theater against the whole of NATO. But one should not lose sight of the fact that although Ukraine right now, it's a kind of ideological objective, subjugation of Ukraine, this is just part of the design. And if anybody has doubts, rewind his story to 2021, when he felt bold enough to issue essentially ultimatum to European countries, demanding nothing less than just, you know, a restriction of sovereignty, you know, special rights, if you like, Russia. Those goals have not changed. So it's just a calculation that today he believes, and that's important, his perception is he can win the war. And if he wins the war, a lot of things would change. He would gain confidence, and others who support him, like China as well, but also he would gain full control over Ukrainian territory, Ukrainian industry, Ukrainian raw materials, and even potentially conscripts. This is really important. So right now, he does not feel confident in opening this line of direct conflict, NATO, but he feels confident enough to conduct an extremely aggressive and growing more brazen each day almost, a hybrid. It's a hybrid aggression, hybrid war, if you like. I just flew in from Warsaw, where the biggest news is, of course, another case of sabotage. I mean, there was an attempt to blow up railway lines, which, surprise, surprise, lead towards the main hub, which supplies particularly military assistance to Ukraine. The investigation is going on, but, it's most likely it's people that Russia hires, either sleepers or even criminals. They could be any nationals. They could be Polish nationals, I don't know, Ukrainian or Russian. But this is the modus operandi. And this is extremely, if you combine this with the massive violations of, airspace by drones that was mentioned, cyber operations, whole thingy that Secretary of State mentioned. Somebody cuts those energy cables. These are not the Martians, It's, for him, this is important to understand, it's a win-win strategy. And one could even argue that he does not need a war, in a classical sense, to get his objectives implemented if he can do it via all these hybrid operations, which are extremely aggressive. One example of that is the use of the so-called shadow fleet, because it's a fleet which Russia controls through, flags of convenience, which is used by Russia to break sanctions. But progressively, the same vessels are being used to conduct security provocations. That happened likely in Germany and also, generally speaking, in the Baltic area. I don't know how much time I have, 2 minutes? If I have 2 minutes, then I would like to... This is a pretty grim picture, but it is a real picture. It's not because one wants to kind of frighten everybody, but one should not try to make any kind of threat assessments on a basis of some sort of romantic vision. This is the reality. And unless he's stopped, unless there is a successful counter-strategy, he will continue in this vein. So let me just mark at least 4 or 5 elements of this counter-strategy. First of all, is the fact that, yes, NATO and its Article 5 remains by far the best, guarantee. Certainly, that's how it seems from the, vantage of the frontier states. If Article 5 remains credible, then those countries which are most threatened, but also the others, they will still feel secure. And that has implications. If you have to implement NATO's regional defense plans, well, then they have to be adopted. You have to, in particular, make sure that you are able to fill in the gaps which might come because the US may have to move resources to the Indo-Pacific, for example, or because it has a certain strategy towards Europe. And frankly speaking, NATO itself has been preparing for this situation because in the defense planning cycle, the bulk of the tasks associated with defending Europe, they follow Europeans anyway, and they keep growing. But all this requires more timely efforts, and everybody's got the job to do, including the eastern flank countries. They have to invest more in, for example, mobility. Some of the timelines should get shorter, like the German presence in Lithuania and so on. And we have to do something what Danes call the Kampfkraft, the combat power. So otherwise there has to be a relationship between all the investments and defense spending and the actual capabilities. So we should not be spending money on the things which may be useful, but, And then, of course, Ukraine, speaking of President Zelensky's visit here, also has a job to do. They have to tackle corruption, because otherwise they will lose, frankly speaking, the support of many countries. They have to do something about the availability of manpower. They have not done it because of political constraints. And as I said, this issue of addressing addressing the Russian drone and other form of hybrid. It's urgent, and it does not contradict all the other investments we should make. And last but not least, and I'll stop there, because I said I'm just flagging, Russia must feel much greater pain that its action bring. And one of the simplest, if you like, and surest ways is to restrict its ability to finance the war, which means the sanctions have to be not just continued, but they have to be stepped up, because also the Russian economy is in essentially a free-fall stage. High inflation, the budget, most of it, close to 50% is spent on the war, and there are growing problems, and we have to actually augment those problems, because if we don't do it, then we are actually allowing Russia to finance the conflict which it's conducting against Ukraine, but also against us. I could go on, but I'll stop there because I think it would be fascinating to have a proper debate. But that's basically how I see the most important issues related to the subject matter that Luis mentioned in whatever, 5, 6, 7 minutes ahead. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Robert, for dissecting the Russian threat in all of its complexity, but also for offering some useful recommendations. And I'm sure we'll come back to some of the points you raised. Let's now maybe turn over to Daniel for to sort of zoom in on the financial, industrial, and technological dimensions of transatlantic and European security, and maybe to get a better sense of what NATO is doing in the industrial and technological domains, but also perhaps how NATO initiatives intersect with EU initiatives, which is something that you've been spending quite a bit of time on. Daniel.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Luis, and it's great to be in Madrid and also here again. I agree with a lot of what's been said, that the Hague summit was a success, although I will add the kind of parenthesis or footnote that a large part of that success is whether or not President Trump blows it up or not. So keeping a lid on things is a mark of success, funnily enough, for Europeans. But apart from that, I think what the Hague summit did was follow on from previous summits in really crystallizing the importance of defense investment and defense production, more importantly, within a NATO context. And as Robert and I were discussing before, he knows a lot more about it than I do, but this was a bit the kind of modus operandi of NATO during the Cold War. There was no question of the link between defense planning, deterrence, and defense production. In the post-Cold War period, we kind of lost that linkage because we, I think, turned our focus more to the high-tech domain. We also invested, I guess, in many countries in Europe in the so-called small is beautiful theory, which is you buy very expensive units, systems, but you buy fewer of them. So it's the kind of like Swiss Army knife theory of military capabilities. And now, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, we've gone back again to this concept of integrating production, defense production and investment within the NATO, I would call it defense planning process a bit more generally. And if you look in a NATO context at the Defense Production Action Plan, the so-called DPAP, this is a political response to reintegrating the importance of defense production and also stockpiling of certain equipment, ammunition, supplies within the NATO defense planning process, so that when you conduct the NDPP, you're also making sure that allies are not just focusing on the high-tech equipment and the capabilities which they obviously need, but they're also not neglecting the importance of strategic depth in the industrial domain, which I think very clearly comes out of The Hague, that defense production is also seen now as part of our defense and deterrence within the alliance. So I think politically that's an important thing to keep in mind. Also on the defense investment levels, it's no surprise to learn that if you look at least even over the last decade, we've doubled defense investment within Europe. Even before the Hague Defense Investment Pledge, allies have been moving already to increase the defense spending. So within Europe, and I agree here with what Anna said, there's a self-awareness within Europe that we need to do much more for burden sharing when it comes to investment in production. However, I would also say that we need to be careful not to think about NATO's defense investment and industrial policies uniquely through the prism of the war on Ukraine and Russia. Because I think that NATO is actually responding to a much broader strategic question, which includes, and I think that was already mentioned by a few speakers, and including the State Secretary, the importance of technology and technology integration. And it is very much, I would say, entering into a so-called brave new world now, where new technologies such as robotics, automated systems, and artificial intelligence are really being seen as the ingredients for cutting-edge technologies. If you look at any program being developed around the world, one of the key problems and one of the key objectives is to integrate these essentially commercial or civilian technologies. So NATO understands that, yes, you need hardware, you need steel, you need to be able to, field the conventional capabilities, but when it comes to command and control, sensing, surveillance, ISR, all of those factors, you need to be in the high-tech realm. There's a third factor as well, which is important, and that is that NATO is responding essentially to structural shifts within the American defense market itself. So I think Anna also used an interesting and correct word, that since President Trump came in for his second term, the Department of War or Defense, whatever you want to call it, has been much more singularly focused on this question of lethality. And politically, they believe they have inherited a defense industry which is too fat, too big, and not really responding to strategic questions. And in particular, they're not really thinking about Russia here, obviously. They're thinking about China particularly. So they want to rewire the defense industry within the US. Now, for them, that creates a few challenges, and for Europeans, that creates a few challenges, because it comes back to this essential bargain of the Americans within the alliance telling us to do more for our defense. But then, and I think, Lewis, you mentioned this in your opening remarks, what is the conditionality of that? What are you going to get in return? So they want Europeans to do more for their defense. That means, yes, putting more boots on the ground, investing in more capabilities. But then on this really sensitive question on how far are the US willing to give the Europeans enough play to develop their own defense sector, that's where it becomes really tricky. Because if you look at the way the US has approached the alliance and alliance politics, it's true that it's been rather erratic, but I think the landing zone is as Anna described it, which is that there is some kind of consistency in approach. Where it has been really business as usual, and even, I would say, a reinforcement of business as usual, is in the defense industrial domain. Europeans have become actually more dependent on the US since the war in Russia. All of our short-term needs, with the exception of countries like Poland and others who have looked beyond the US to Korea, elsewhere, the large majority of European states have invested in American produce and products. That also means, by the way, that that's having an impact on the US policy cycle. Very recently, they've started to adapt their foreign military sales mechanism, the way they want to sell to allies, they want to try and make it easier. So that raises a question for Europeans, because when it comes to the public debate and the investment debate, how far can governments sustain this idea of investing much more in defense, but not necessarily getting much return in terms of economic investment? On the capability side, you will essentially buy American products, and that will give you security, as it were. But governments don't only think about capability. They're thinking about economic opportunity, they're thinking about the technological added value of investments, and that's where it gets really, really tricky for European allies. By the way, I don't come here with an answer to that question, and I don't think NATO has an answer to that question right now, because it's very, very political. One final point, and maybe that comes a bit to the where the EU and NATO interfaces on this as well. I think it's quite interesting in the defense investment pledge that was agreed at Hague, 5%. If I can be very candid, I don't think there's one ally that thinks they will meet that 5% anytime soon, right? I mean, that's the reality of it. It's a target that has been agreed. Many states are trying to get to the 5%. But when you start to unpack it, you start to see there are also political opportunities and sensitivities there. On the 3.5% on core defense spending, that will be the trickiest element for allies to really meet, because 3.5% is a big ask. It's quite difficult. But the focus on core defense capabilities will be the biggest challenge. I actually think the 1.5% part of the pledge is the easier part of it. And that's probably why it was put in there, by the way, as well. But the 1.5% is really interesting because if you start to look at what that means in terms of investment, defense innovation, critical infrastructure protection, these are all areas which the EU finances quite well already. So I guess what we should expect now, and that comes to what Anna also raised, is implementation. It would be very interesting to see in the coming months and years whether NATO and the EU genuinely come to some kind of cooperative arrangement on the 1.5%. So doing much more in those areas which are not strictly core defense, but which improve or enhance the deterrence of the alliance and the European Union. That will also be sensitive, but the good news is that there is much more money coming online for those types of activities, which could have a key benefit for the alliance and European security. I'll end there.
Excellent, thanks. Thank you, Daniel. That was great, and also some very juicy statements on investment and percentages, which are, of course, very relevant in a Spanish context. So I'm sure we'll come back to some of the points that you've raised. We're going to now pivot towards the south, which, of course, is a very important subject for Spain, and we haven't quite covered yet. Carlos, tú serviste como experto español hace poco en el grupo del secretario general, ¿no? para el vecindario sur. Entonces, aprovechando que te tenemos aquí, que es un lujo, como siempre, contar contigo, a ver si nos puedes explicar un poco cómo encaja el vecindario sur en todo esto. ¿Cómo se come todo esto con el sur? Sobre todo en una agenda OTAN que cada vez parece que estar cada vez más centrada en torno al flanco este y a la amenaza rusa y tal. Y quizá, pues, si puedes también traer un poco a colación la perspectiva, si no española, pues una perspectiva española, que sería la tuya. Bienvenido.
Muchas gracias, Luis. Buenas tardes. Gracias al Cano por invitarme a esta jornada que tiene el apoyo de Alianza Atlántica y también a todos ustedes por haber reservado un tiempo de su agenda para escucharnos. Sí, parece que yo estoy situado en el sur, en esta mesa, y me toca hablar sobre una perspectiva que a veces se ha olvidado demasiado. A veces, no siempre. Y demasiado, pero no totalmente. De hecho, yo creo que la Cumbre de Madrid en el año 2002, al establecer el nuevo concepto estratégico, se cuidó mucho, se hacía aquí, entre otras cosas, España, de no olvidarlo, de no olvidar la perspectiva del sur. Y, de hecho, un año después, la Cumbre de Vilnius retomó el guante y encargó al secretario general la organización de este grupo de expertos independientes para llevar a cabo una reflexión que pudiera presentarse al Consejo Atlántico de cara, en la Cumbre de Washington, a tomar decisiones. De hecho, decisiones se tomaron. Yo quiero recordar, por ejemplo, que hay un representante especial del secretario general para la vecindad sur, un diplomático español, Javier Colomina, que lo está haciendo estupendamente, y que, además, si uno hace repaso de las actividades que desde Washington han tenido lugar hacia el sur, pues sale una larga, interesante y bien orientada lista. De manera que miramos, lógicamente, mucho al este, miramos al sur y tenemos que mirar al sur, porque nuestra seguridad no solo está en el este, está en el sur. En el sur nos podemos encontrar con el conflicto palestino-israelí, nos podemos encontrar con las interferencias de poderes extra y regionales. Todos podemos tener los nombres en la cabeza de esos agentes. Pero tenemos también otra serie de cuestiones que no puede olvidar una alianza que es militar, pero también es política, como la OTAN. Por ejemplo, la desigualdad. En el sur nos encontramos con la mayor desigualdad entre el norte y los países en vías de desarrollo, que se decía antes, del planeta. Y claro, esa desigualdad, lo mismo que las interferencias exteriores, lo mismo que el conflicto palestino-israelí, generan inseguridad, amenazas y oportunidades para lo bueno y también para lo malo. Antes que la OTAN, la Unión Europea lo entendió muy bien. De hecho, este año conmemoramos el 30 aniversario, nada menos, ¿verdad?, de la Conferencia Euromediterránea de Barcelona y el 20 de Barcelona más 10. Yo tuve la suerte de ser un eurodiputado que estuvo en las delegaciones del Parlamento Europeo en ambas ocasiones. Y entonces no se tenía una situación como la que hoy vivimos en el este, de manera que era más sencillo quizás mirar hacia el sur, pero tenemos que hacerlo. Yo creo que la OTAN necesita un enfoque estratégico renovado hacia el sur. ¿Y esto qué significa? ¿Que no hemos hecho nada hasta la fecha? Eso no es verdad. El diálogo político, el diálogo mediterráneo, cumple sus 30 años de vida también. Y la iniciativa de cooperación de Estambul cumple sus 20 años de vida. Pero es verdad que hay que darle una nueva dimensión. Una dimensión de 360 grados, incluyendo todos los temas, no solo los militares, si se me permite, otros muchísimos, políticos, económicos, sociales, etc. Un enfoque regional, porque tiene que haber un enfoque regional, aunque quizás a veces más que vecindad sur deberíamos decir vecindad del sur, porque hablamos del Oriente Medio, del Próximo Oriente, del Mediterráneo, incluso del Sahel, y también un enfoque que sea capaz de trabajar con los socios de manera global, pero diferenciada, y además no exclusiva. Conviene que entendamos que los países de la vecindad sur tienen sus estrategias, prioridades e intereses y no pasan única y exclusivamente por nosotros, por la OTAN y la Unión Europea, pasan por otros. Si se me permite, tenemos que ser más atractivos que nadie, más rápidos que nadie y más constructivos que nadie si queremos que otros no ocupen el lugar que nosotros queremos tener. Y en esa dirección, obviamente, hay que abordar muchas cuestiones. Yo diría que la OTAN tiene que hacer un trabajo temático y regional. Temático, vuelvo a repetir, hay que hablar de la seguridad, pero hay que hablar también del cambio climático, hay que hablar también del papel de la mujer, de los problemas que plantean en los países del sur un crecimiento demográfico que para nosotros quisiéramos, diría alguno, pero que allí es una oportunidad y también un problema. Y muchas otras cuestiones. Y decía antes también un enfoque regional. Es imprescindible reforzar, reactivar el diálogo mediterráneo, la iniciativa de cooperación de Estambul, pero también saber entender lo que cada uno de los socios espera de nosotros. Y no todos esperan lo mismo. Puede que en Marruecos esperen una cosa, puede que en Argelia esperen otra, puede que en Israel esperen otra distinta, y así sucesivamente, pero todos son socios. Para ese trabajo debemos ser conscientes, Luis, de algo que me parece muy importante y que no tenemos en Europa. En el sur hay una percepción negativa de la OTAN. No se asusten, esto es la realidad, no lo digo yo. Lo demuestran los sondeos que machaconamente hace la OTAN sobre la opinión pública y nuestra organización. Y no son buenos, por muchas razones. La OTAN es un instrumento norteamericano, la OTAN es un instrumento de dominación, es sobre todo un instrumento militar duro. Eso lo piensa mucha gente, y sobre todo los sectores más jóvenes en los países del sur. Y eso hay que contrarrestarlo. Sin duda hay que contrarrestarlo, por ejemplo, subrayando que la OTAN hacia el sur debe trabajar sobre la base de su segunda y tercera tareas centrales, la prevención y la gestión de crisis y la construcción de la seguridad cooperativa. Y utilizando mecanismos que quizás en Europa no sean tan imprescindibles, pero de cara a la vecindad o vecindad del sur son imprescindibles. Me refiero, lógicamente, al diálogo político y a la diplomacia pública y a la comunicación. Cuando uno no se explica por sí mismo qué es y qué hace, otros nos explican. Y no nos explican precisamente para bien, porque para eso no son amigos de la OTAN. En esa dirección, yo creo que hay muchas cosas que se pueden poner en marcha, sin duda alguna, que se pueden profundizar, y algunas de ellas se están haciendo. Por ejemplo, ha habido reuniones del diálogo mediterráneo con el secretario general y la vicesecretaria general de la iniciativa de cooperación de Estambul también. Se han celebrado reuniones de los socios con el Consejo Atlántico. Incluso se han abierto oficinas de enlace de la OTAN en Jordania. Y bueno, yo quiero llamar la atención sobre esto, porque es algo que me pareció subrayable durante el trabajo del grupo de expertos independientes. A pesar de lo que estaba ocurriendo en Gaza, que todos conocemos y cada uno puede definir como mejor considere, yo tengo mi definición muy clara, en ningún momento se ha roto ese diálogo mediterráneo. A pesar de que en ese diálogo mediterráneo no todo el mundo está de acuerdo con todo. Ya me entienden. Bueno, eso es un logro de la OTAN, qué duda cabe. Es un logro, yo diría también, que se tiene que poner en marcha en coordinación con la Unión Europea. Decía Luis con mucha razón que yo estuve 15 años, que se dice pronto, en el Parlamento Europeo. Les voy a confesar que la primera vez que entré en la sede de la OTAN fue en octubre, mejor dicho, a finales de octubre del año 23, como miembro del grupo de expertos independientes. Oiga, yo no me dedicaba a la Comisión de Agricultura en el Parlamento Europeo. A lo mejor me hubiera gustado. Yo fui miembro de la Comisión de Asuntos Exteriores, Seguridad, Política y Defensa durante 12 años y medio. ¿Alguien puede explicar que yo no pasara por la sede de la OTAN? Claro, es que eran organizaciones que se miraban con mucho recelo, casi de espaldas. Uno estaba haciendo sus cosas y que el otro no se metiera en lo suyo. Y otro podía pensar que el otro era un tanto ingenuo en lo que hacía y que había que centrarse en cuestiones más duras, que suele decirse. Bueno, la coordinación entre Unión Europea y OTAN, cada uno en su papel, es imprescindible. Otra cosa es porque la mayor parte de los miembros de la Unión Europea lo son de la OTAN, aunque no todos. Y está claro que ese papel de coordinación con la Unión Europea debe extenderse también a otras entidades. Estoy pensando, por ejemplo, en la Unión por el Mediterráneo, estoy pensando en el Consejo de Cooperación del Golfo, en la Liga Árabe, en la Unión Africana, en la OSCE, seguro que a otros se le ocurrirán muchos más. ¿Tenemos instrumentos para hacer todo esto en la OTAN? Bueno, el Grupo de Expertos Independientes se nombró muy oportunamente el 6 de octubre del año 23. El 7 de octubre se produjeron los atentados terroristas de Hamás. A lo mejor esa reflexión hubiera tenido que realizarse antes, pero se hizo a tiempo, si me permiten. Por ejemplo, tenemos un representante especial del secretario general, tenemos también un centro en Nápoles, el Hub para el Sur, que hay que redefinir, hay que dotar mucho más las estructuras de la OTAN, hay que tratar de estar más presente en los países, no ser, digamos, como golondrinas en cuanto a la relación y las reuniones. No se puede estar en una época del año y desaparecer el resto, y así sucesivamente. Bueno, creo que tenemos muchas oportunidades, pero hablar de Ucrania, hablar del este, flanco este se suele decir en la OTAN. A mí lo de flanco me suena muy duro y prefiero decir el lado este. Y olvidar el sur es estar equivocándose. Y yo creo que la OTAN está en el camino de tratar de evitar equivocarse, sin duda alguna, también con el empuje de España. No voy a meter en lo que el Gobierno de España ha dicho y sigue diciendo, y por cierto estoy de acuerdo, respecto al 5% famoso, pero en la Unión Europea yo creo que hay una clara idea de que si todo se hace de la manera más integrada, planificada, estratégicamente orientada, como en cualquier casa de vecino, no hay que gastar más, incluso se puede gastar menos, pero mejor. Pero eso ya es mi opinión, que meto como una coda después de haber hablado sobre el sur. Gracias.
Muy bien, muchas gracias. En tu derecho estás de colar eso ahí. Muy curiosa la anécdota de que no pisases la OTAN en 15 años de eurodiputado. Vaya tela.
Pasaba por delante cuando había atasco en la autovía. Entonces los choferes se desviaban y nos pasaban por delante. Tengo que reconocer que viendo desde fuera la anterior sede y viendo desde dentro la anterior, debe haber alguna mejora.
Sí, las hay. Bueno, fantástico. Muchas gracias, Carlos, por abrir la conversación, no solo en un sentido geográfico, sino también temático, y por hacerlo, como siempre, de una forma tan elocuente y tan persuasiva. Nos quedan 25 minutos, entonces vamos a abrir el debate, ¿vale? Vamos a recoger preguntas, comentarios del público, las agruparemos. Yo creo que veo a casi todos, así que no os lancéis todos a la vez y abrimos el turno de preguntas. Creo que hay micrófonos por ahí. Sí, Ana, mira, tenemos una aquí en la segunda fila y otra aquí en la tercera. Por favor, identificaros, nombre, afiliación, horóscopo, todas esas cosas importantes.
¿Me toca iniciar? ¿Sí?
Sí, adelante.
Pues buenos días a todos. Soy Mazali Aguilar, ex eurodiputada la anterior legislatura en el Parlamento Europeo. Me ha hecho mucha gracia el comentario que ha hecho el señor Carnero, porque yo sí he estado en la Comisión de Agricultura. He sido vicepresidente de la Comisión de Agricultura, pero también he estado en la Comisión de Seguridad y Defensa y en la delegación de la OTAN. A ver, no puedo estar más de acuerdo con él. Quiero decir que el flanco sur es verdad, aunque te moleste, perdón que te tutee, pero sí que es verdad que mi experiencia en esta legislatura anterior ha sido un poco en la línea que él ha comentado. Dos cosas me gustaría. Qué pena que el representante del gobierno español no haya estado aquí, porque la pregunta que yo me hubiera gustado hacerle es, habida cuenta del escasísimo porcentaje que el gobierno español dedica a la defensa de su Producto Interior Bruto, estaba mirando un poco la información de la OTAN del año 24, estamos hablando de no llegar al 2%. Tuve el honor y el privilegio de representar al Parlamento Europeo el año 22 en octubre, en una sesión de la OTAN, donde la ministra de Defensa decía que estábamos preparados para tener el 2.5 en el año 29. Y estábamos en el año 22, en ese sentido. A ver, dos preguntas muy claras para mí. ¿Qué ocurre si España no llega al porcentaje que estaba comentando el señor Carnero también, de ese 5%, habida cuenta de que estamos en la cola de la lista de los países pertenecientes a la OTAN? ¿Qué sucede? ¿Nos echan? ¿No nos echan? ¿Nos quedamos? ¿Somos el último de la fila? Y dos, el señor Carnero ha hecho también un comentario respecto a esa zona sur. Créanme, yo no sé si al resto de las personas que están aquí, a mí me preocupa sobremanera qué va a suceder efectivamente con esos vecinos tan especiales que tenemos y la posición que España en estos momentos está teniendo respecto a los Estados Unidos de Norteamérica, que no es lo más amigable, y como representante, digamos, en esta OTAN, del que, bueno, hablar de España en estos momentos, insisto, en la situación que tenemos, no es lo más beneficioso para nuestra nación. Muchas gracias.
Muy bien, muchas gracias por esas dos preguntas muy claras. Ya os aviso que vamos a volver. So we're going to come back in reverse order. So we'll do Carlos first, then Daniel, then Robert, then Ana. Vamos a recoger un par de preguntas más, si las hay. Tenemos una aquí, en la tercera fila. Por favor.
Hola, buenos días. ¿Se me oye? Vale.
Perfectamente.
Bueno, en primer lugar, muchísimas gracias por esta mesa redonda. Me ha parecido súper interesante. Yo me llamo Borja Álvarez, estudié un máster de Relaciones Internacionales en la Universidad de San Pablo y ahora me encuentro preparando posiciones para trabajar en la Unión Europea. Y bueno, mi pregunta es un tanto directa, es hasta qué punto la OTAN o qué probabilidad estima la OTAN en el corto o medio plazo de que Rusia ataque militarmente o de algún otro modo algún país OTAN, más allá de los envíos de drones y invasiones del espacio aéreo. Muchas gracias.
Muy bien. Porcentaje de posibilidades de que Rusia ataque. Quiero un número exacto, 23% y además en un año determinado. Ana, creo que tenemos allí al embajador allí en la penúltima fila y creo que otra más. Vamos a... Y ya como nos quedan 20 minutos, vamos a aprovechar, en caso de que no hubiese tiempo para una segunda ronda, os pido... Vale, perfecto, tenemos más. Embajador.
Sí, muchas gracias. Soy Manuel Acerete, diplomático. Yo tenía dos preguntas. Una relativa al tema de la voluntad de combatir, porque realmente hace falta para la defensa y para la disuasión tener capacidades. Para tener capacidades hace falta gastar, porcentaje se ha fijado en la cumbre de la OTAN, pero también hace falta una voluntad de combatir. Yo creo que ahí está ahí está la máxima ventaja que tiene Rusia y que tiene Ucrania, que es pues unos ejércitos que están demostrando, para bien o para mal, mal en el caso de Rusia, una voluntad de combatir con grandes pérdidas. Eso en Occidente a lo mejor no lo tenemos. Es importante una cultura de defensa en ese sentido, pero yendo más allá también creo que haría falta entrar en lo que comentaba al principio Ana, que es el vínculo con Estados Unidos. Para Putin, él tiene el ejemplo de Stalin, que pasó de la casi total derrota en la Segunda Guerra Mundial a una victoria arrolladora, a su manera. Entonces, nosotros necesitamos también tener esa voluntad de combatir, pero para ello hace falta el vínculo con Estados Unidos posiblemente. Si existiera ese decoupling, esa desvinculación entre paraguas nuclear estadounidense, pero defensa convencional a cargo de los aliados europeos, posiblemente ahí algo fallaría. Si no hay el tripwire americano de presencia convencional y compromiso convencional en Europa, a lo mejor la disuasión nuclear no es tan convincente. Si no hay una disuasión nuclear convincente, quizá la voluntad de combatir desde ese punto de vista ante las amenazas nucleares repetidas, aunque sean retóricas de Rusia, no es, digamos, tan asumible para los europeos. Realmente, ¿cómo podemos lograr que el burden sharing y también un cierto leadership sharing de los europeos no se traduzca en una desvinculación respecto a Estados Unidos, en lo cual los europeos a lo mejor no tendrían la moral de combate para poder vencer en un conflicto? Esa era una pregunta quizá un poco desperdigada. La otra cuestión respecto al flanco sur, a la dimensión sur. Muchas gracias por las explicaciones de Carlos. Yo creo que es efectivamente muy importante que la OTAN contribuya a eso, pero la cuestión es cuál es su valor añadido, porque no pueden todos hacerlo todo. La OTAN, la Unión Europea, otros foros, posiblemente en lo que hace la OTAN hay algo que falta y algo a lo mejor que pudiera sobrar si vamos demasiado lejos. No puede suplir lo que hace, por ejemplo, la Unión Europea, que ahora está con los aniversarios citados y con el pacto por el Mediterráneo o para el Mediterráneo, según se quiera plantear parte de la Unión Europea. No creo yo que la OTAN deba hacer exactamente lo mismo. Sí que debe tener un diálogo y una cooperación. El diálogo mediterráneo de hace 30 años ha ido por ahí. Y sin embargo, a lo mejor lo que falta es, aunque suene un poco militarista y contradictorio con la necesidad de buscar una relación de confianza con el sur, lo que puede faltar es quizá el valor añadido de la OTAN desde el punto de vista militar frente a los retos que se plantean en el sur. Eso requiere el acompañamiento de la relación de diálogo y confianza con esos países, un sur muy amplio, cada vez más hacia el sur y más hacia el este, pero también requiere que la OTAN se tome en serio la dimensión sur, no solamente para hacer cosas que ya puede hacer la Unión Europea o los Estados miembros de ambas organizaciones, sino también tomarse en serio que la estructura militar que está desarrollando la OTAN con una mayor, digamos, dimensión por el reto que tenemos en el este, también sirve para retos en el sur, militarmente. Diálogo, cooperación muy importante, capacity building muy importante, pero también capacidad de defensa, máximo cuando hay potencias como la propia Rusia, que también desarrollan su capacidad militar en el Sahel, por ejemplo, en estos momentos, o en Libia. Muchas gracias.
Muchas gracias, embajador. Vamos a coger una última pregunta que tenemos aquí y ya vamos a volver a los ponentes, como decía, en orden inverso. Tendréis aproximadamente unos 3 minutos y medio cada uno para observaciones finales.
Hola, buenos días. Muchas gracias por sus intervenciones. Me llamo Nuria Leonard y junto con mis compañeras pertenecemos al Cuerpo Superior de Administradores Civiles del Estado, el también conocido como TAC, y somos de la última promoción. Y bueno, primero darles las gracias por sus interesantes intervenciones. Mi pregunta iba en relación y también en representación del sector joven y en relación con lo que ha apuntado Carlos Carnero en relación con este rechazo que existe por parte de la población joven, nuestras generaciones, sobre la OTAN, este rechazo y esta mala imagen que tiene. Al final, el tema de esta charla va sobre el fortalecimiento de la OTAN, y el fortalecimiento de la OTAN no es más que el fortalecimiento, en primer lugar, de las Fuerzas Armadas de los Estados miembros. Entonces, a mí durante la intervención se me ha planteado la duda, y viendo un poco lo que piensa la gente joven sobre estos debates que se están trayendo a colección en Europa, en muchos países europeos, sobre el restablecimiento del servicio militar obligatorio, sobre incluso en Rusia, que han salido unas noticias recientemente que ahora se están introduciendo asignaturas en los colegios sobre el fomento de la identidad rusa, sobre también esta idea de captar futuros soldados. Mi pregunta y mi inquietud va sobre todo con cómo casar este necesario fortalecimiento de la OTAN, que pasa por el fortalecimiento de los recursos humanos de las Fuerzas Armadas de los Estados miembros, con este rechazo y con esta, digamos, falta de voluntad que existe por parte de los jóvenes, que somos al final los que en un futuro trataremos de resolver estos problemas, y con las posibles consecuencias que ello puede generar en relación con si se genera este rechazo por parte de la población joven, cómo puede afectar a nivel de desestabilización política, protestas, auge incluso de populismos que traten de dar una respuesta a estas quejas de los jóvenes, y un poco cómo casar estas dos extremos que se pueden generar. Muchas gracias.
Muy bien, muchas gracias por esa pregunta, ese comentario. So we're going to come back to the panel now for final reflections. Don't feel obliged to answer every single question, but if you can address some of the themes that were raised, you've got about three minutes each. We're going to start with Carlos, then Daniel, then Robert, then Ana. Carlos.
Con mucho gusto, Luis. Empezando por la última cuestión, precisamente una de las propuestas del grupo de expertos independientes tenía que ver con los jóvenes y concretamente con promover un compromiso de los jóvenes en el diálogo entre la OTAN y los países de la vecindad sur. En ese sentido, hay una iniciativa de una cumbre anual de la OTAN dedicada a la juventud, por así decirlo, con una presencia y participación de la gente joven, lo que quiere decir, evidentemente, de la sociedad civil. Pero, yendo más allá a tu pregunta, yo diría lo siguiente. Si presentamos a las nuevas generaciones lo militar en términos clásicos, nos podemos olvidar. Nos podemos olvidar. Ahora, si presentamos lo militar como un instrumento clave para prevenir conflictos, gestionar crisis, mantener la paz y mantener la paz también en base a una disuasión suficiente, estaremos entrando por la vía correcta, en mi opinión. Eso es en buena medida lo que hacen nuestros ejércitos en estos momentos y, por lo menos por lo que respecta a España, con gran éxito en muchos lugares del planeta. En segundo lugar, ¿cuál es el valor añadido de la OTAN? Y esta es una pregunta que nos hicimos en el grupo de expertos independientes muchas veces. Porque si la Unión Europea, en cumplimiento de su tratado, llega a tener en su día una defensa común, ¿cómo armonizar esa defensa común con una OTAN a la que pertenecen la mayor parte de sus miembros? La respuesta puede parecer muy complicada, pero es sencilla. La OTAN es un marco en el que los europeos, en nuestra gran mayoría, colaboramos con otros países, el más potente, los Estados Unidos, y otros como Canadá o Turquía, si Turquía nunca llega a ser miembro en incumplimiento de nuestros compromisos de la Unión Europea. Por lo tanto, este es un valor añadido. Y en el ámbito de la prevención y gestión de crisis y, sobre todo, de la construcción de seguridad cooperativa, es donde la OTAN alcanza, por sus conocimientos, información, organización y capacidad de estar presente en todos los ámbitos, un valor añadido muy importante. Puedo pensar en cuestiones que nunca serían públicas, obviamente, pero que pueden ser imprescindibles para muchos gobiernos del sur, en un lugar o en otro del Mediterráneo, en el Sahel o en el Oriente Medio. Ese es el valor añadido, pero no puede ser únicamente un valor añadido en términos militares. Vuelvo a lo de antes. La OTAN no puede presentarse si me permiten, como la OTAN de siempre. No quiero que cambie el nombre, no quiero que cambie su logo, pero la OTAN está ahora tratando de hacer muchas más cosas que las que la Guerra Fría imponía como prioridades. Y eso pasa, evidentemente, por la vecindad sur. La OTAN y España. No voy yo a explicar aquí la posición del Gobierno español porque no lo represento. Ya ha hablado el secretario de Estado. Pero vuelvo a repetir lo anterior. Estamos abocados a integrar nuestras capacidades, a planificar nuestras capacidades. Si eso se hace en la Unión Europea, multiplicaremos nuestra eficacia y tendremos los gastos que sean necesarios a esos efectos. Si no habláramos de ningún porcentaje, a lo mejor nos evitábamos algunas cuestiones que nos pueden llevar a tótems, a cifras míticas, pero que generalmente tienen que ver con la realidad relativamente. Yo quiero recordar que los Estados Unidos de América no gastan el 5% en defensa. No gastan el 5% en defensa. Y en un país como el nuestro, querida colega, antigua eurodiputada, como yo he tenido la ocasión de trabajar contigo, ha sido un gusto, sin duda alguna, en estos años pasados. Un país como el nuestro es muy importante, por muchísimas cuestiones. Por nuestra fuerza militar, bueno, en parte sí, pero también por nuestra ubicación geopolítica, nuestra comprensión de la realidad del sur, por ejemplo, y también cuestiones tan claves como las bases militares de los Estados Unidos en nuestro país, que alguien podría decir, si se monetizaran, valdrían mucho dinero, valdrían muchísimo dinero, cosa que nosotros no hacemos, porque no monetizamos lo que forma parte de una alianza irrompible, indestructible, esté uno u otro en la Casa Blanca.
Muy bien, muchas gracias. Carlos, so I'm going to ask you all to be brilliant and brief. Brief because if you're not, Daniel will miss his plane back to Brussels.
So will you.
And he'll have someone to blame. So will I, yes.
We will
Daniel,
both
then
miss.
Robert, then Anna.
Yeah, thanks. Let's be brief. I'll take 2 points. I think the first point is on the 2% and the consequences of not spending 2%. I mean, Spain and any ally cannot be kicked out of the alliance for not meeting a spending requirement. It's not a legal category per se, but there are repercussions for not doing it, right? And I guess in the current political climate, the major risk is that you will be victimized by the guy and administration in the White House, and maybe in a more serious way, which is not just to focus on Spain, but to use, as they see it, those that are falling behind as an excuse to move the alliance and Europe more generally. So to use them as a bargaining chip with the rest. And that is particularly important with the US government in terms of the relationship between trade, economic and technology policy and defense. So as thinking strategically, we cannot compartmentalize every policy area. For them, it's connected for America. I would say, however, that the discussion probably in Spain needs to not be focused so much on what the outside world, as important as it is, would do. Some of our discussions today already have been focusing maybe on having a much more coherent national strategy on defense, where you bring together what you want to do strategically with investment levels, investment plans over the long period of time. And it connects actually with the question about young people in the sector and the point that was raised by the ambassador about will to fight. It's really interesting when you look at public opinion polls, when the question is asked, do you want more European defense, more responsibility for European defense? Talking of percentages, it's always 89, 90, 95%. Everyone wants more defense. If you ask the follow-on question, are you willing to fight for that defense? The percentage immediately drops to 30. Now, where we have to be really careful is in which countries we're talking about. Because actually, if you look at a lot of European countries, it's changed completely, this mentality. In Belgium, where we're also based, incredibly, a lot more young people are going straight from university into the military. And because the government have asked them, and also because they feel more of a patriotic duty of going into the military. I don't need to talk about Anna's experiences in the Baltics and the Nordic states. It's the same thing. Conscription is being brought in, and people do want to go into the military. I think also another important point which we should not forget is that contribution to defense is not just about wearing military uniforms. The big problem we have today is we do not have skilled people in science, tech, mathematics, all of these subjects, going into technology and defense industry. It's simply not happening. So when you think of a career or a potential career in this domain, it's not just about fighting on the front lines. It's a much bigger contribution. And I think, and that's the final point, our governments and politicians can do a much better job at communicating this fact to society.
Excellent. Thanks, Daniel. Robert?
Okay, war. I try to not frighten you, but tell you how things, I believe, are. So let me address it directly. If you look at statements, I mean, from the Secretary General, lots of German journals, that they, you know, whatever, and other, of course, military heads and so on. Well, 2028, 2029, by 2030, there's a rest. Personally, I mean, this may be true, but as I try to explain, you know, there's nothing inevitable about this because Russia may get its objectives met in other ways. But the key thing is you have to prepare. And to link this to the young people are the same everywhere. In Poland, where theoretically, well, not theoretically, the threat perception is much, much, much higher. But if you ask, for instance, about reinstating conscription, there is a majority support, but not within the categories of the young people who would have to be conscripted. But, you know, 1937, there was an Oxford Debating Society debate. Would you fight for king and country? And the people said we would. They lost. So what? 1939, the same people went and fought in the war. So there has to be a reality check. You know, young people, like older people like me, they have to think for themselves. And if something is not done in terms of explaining the current threats, then there is a problem with the information policy, to be very honest. And that's usually the responsibility of the governments. You can't blame NATO anymore because no government, unfortunately, I see some familiar faces from I spent in NATO, has protested about actually disbanding the public diplomacy division, which was praised earlier. Now that you need it most. They were. Spain, of course, as Daniel said, you know, no country has ever been kicked out of NATO and so on, and it should not be because the rules are a bit, you know, I think the other candidates, let me be blunt, frankly, Spain. But, you know, there are consequences. There is a reason why there is a E5 meetings, which do not include Spain. It should include Spain, but it doesn't, and there is a reason. Because Spain, right now, still has a reputation of not spending enough on defense. And words have a meaning. Whether you go to EU on a NATO communiques, there is, you know, countries formally agree, even Hungary. So if the spending also 5%, well, by hook or crook, they have to be somehow met. And this is a serious issue. You can't get around this. So, well, it's not for me to, you know, offer recommendations. In terms of fighting, the last point. In terms of the bulk of the land forces, let's be honest. The bulk of defending, if it comes to that, the most vulnerable countries on the eastern flank, which is the Baltic countries, would fall on Poland and Germany in terms of land forces, supported by, of course, our colleagues north. But, you know, that's the reality. But, you know, we cannot be in a situation where other countries say, because it's far away, we will not do our bit. That is not acceptable. That's not how the Cold War was won. So the expectation, there is this dichotomy because South and East is a false one. If you don't spend on defense properly, you will not have the capabilities which could have any consequential role in the security equation in the Middle East, in the Mediterranean. It's just as simple as that. You know, if you don't have I think Napoleon, right? Where is the artillery? So I'm sorry, but there is no getting away from the need to invest in defense. And as I said, words have a meaning. The words of solidarity have a meaning. But the most important thing is, the more you invest, the more you do everything possible to prevent the war. That is the thing where the, you know, people who have very strong pacifism, you call it like that, well, I don't see a contradiction with those who actually want to spend more on defense, because if you don't, you invite the predators. And if you believe this is not the age of predators, well, then you are living in a slightly unreal world. And we haven't even talked about China. and the strategic dependency, including economic one. So, this is subject for different conversation, but I think the questions were really excellent, and there are good answers for them, actually.
Indeed. Thank you for your candor and passion, Robert. Back to Anna for closing reflection.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief, but I think this is, I just have a couple of very short points. Building on what Robert said, I think Europe, we always have to remind ourselves that we have a shared destiny. We know that through history. If it's Spain or Sweden or Romania, we have a shared destiny. We go wrong, we fall into war when we think that we can be saved or hide or hedge. That is not the case. And therefore, I think the way we have to think about defense is not in a budgetary way, defense, health, infrastructure, school, and where to spend and, where to increase, decrease, like that. We have to take defense and security and make it the platform for our societies. And that's the message to the youth. If you want to preserve the way of life you think, you take for granted the way you have been raised. I have 3 sons, I know exactly, from 23 to 12. And they are very comfortable in the way they perceive life, peace, their opportunities. But that cannot be taken for granted, that's one, and it comes with a cost. And that's hard messaging for them. But we have a responsibility to tell everyone that this is how it works. Defense and security is the platform for us to build prosperity in the future. And this is what we have to figure out. And that's also a good message towards politicians, I think, towards private sector I sit with a lot. They also think about this in a budgetary way, but that's not the whole way we can think about it, because we have to solve the puzzle. This is our shared destiny. How do we pave the future to preserve peace?
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much for that closing statement. Bueno, lamentablemente estamos ya en el minuto de descuento, con lo cual os vais a quedar sin mi resumen final, que me dicen que suelen ser brillantes, pero no vais a tener tiempo de comprobarlo. Lo que sí que quería pediros es que, por favor, os unáis a mí en agradecer a nuestros ponentes por una magnífica intervención.